All right, welcome to a new episode of Cali Claptrap. Today we have guest Mark Forman. Mark, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here, Matt.
Awesome. So Mark, you've written a book called Monster's Journey. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your background and maybe how you came to write this book.
So I am a licensed psychologist in the state of California, and I've been practicing therapy and psychotherapy for probably about 20 years now, and if you include training all the way up through being licensed and having a practice. And part of that time was spent focusing on kids and adolescents and families. And probably about 10 years ago, I made a switch towards moving towards adults and couples. So I've really seen kind of the broad range of clients, and one of the issues that started to show up in my office was that of early childhood trauma. And trauma was not particularly an interest of mine. In graduate school, obviously, we covered a certain amount of it and talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what happens to people as adults. So I was educated to a degree, but hadn't really dove into any of the childhood material. Now, what was kind of ironic was what I didn't know or really hadn't put together in any way was that I had had some pretty intense childhood trauma. And so this thing started to happen a little bit in parallel where I was seeing more clients, and in my personal life, I was seeing more and more that seemed to suggest I had a lot going on from my past. And that took a long time to unpack. It took a while for me to get into trauma-focused therapy. I had been in other kinds of therapies for sure. But when I did enter that trauma-focused therapy, sort of, it seemed like everything I knew about myself kind of crumbled, and it all got sort of rebuilt through the lens of my childhood experience. And after being with that and working with a lot more clients with trauma, this book emerged. And the name of the book is called The Monster's Journey. And it's a variation on the very well-known hero's journey that Joseph Campbell introduced to us. And it basically asks the question, is there a different journey for people who have early childhood trauma? Does their growth work exactly the same way that the typical hero would have their journey? And the answer to the question, after a lot of time of thinking about it, was no. There's some key differences between the two paths, and the purpose of the book was really to put that into words and suggest how what the journey is and how to recover from childhood trauma, what the steps are, just like Joseph Campbell outlined the steps for spiritual and psychological change for people who had more or less are not trauma survivors.
Yeah. So one of the questions I had sort of reading the book, and you go into detail, but I was hoping you could do it on the podcast here, is to choose the word monster. Sort of what led you to use that metaphor?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the trickier topics in the book, and one that I've thought a lot about. So when I was in trauma therapy, just beginning, and I was in a new relationship at the time with a woman who was a trained trauma therapist, I started to have just insights were happening with some frequency. And one of the insights that came up was that I had this feeling of being very different and alienated from the world that was outside of me. Now, I'd had that feeling since I was a child, and it stayed with me. But what floated up to the top of my mind was like an image of being a troll kind of under a bridge outside of like a village with typical people. So it's almost kind of like an image from a, fairy tale or uh um monster story. And in
Hmm.
that I felt like the troll.
Yeah.
um and to unpack what that means, I felt that there were all these things that were either wrong with me or different about me, or sort of abnormal, not typical. And when I started to dig into my trauma with this image in mind, it occurred to me that I had gone through this change very early in my life where there was early trauma, and I came out differently probably than uh, if the trauma wasn't there. And specifically for folks who are listening, the trauma was that my father, at around the time I was basically 2 or 3 years old, had a psychotic breakdown, which means in psychological terms, he lost his contact with reality. He became super intense and what we would call grandiose. In other words, he saw himself as really a kind of messiah figure in a religious sense. And during that time, he just became totally out of touch with the reality of being a father. And, he and my mother separated, and my relationship with him changed because he became frightening. Whereas
Hmm.
at least my sense is that when I was born, he was relatively kind of intact and there,
Yeah.
uh, some form of a regular father.
Hmm.
And so as I started to unpack this, I began to see that period of 2 or 3 to about 5 or 6 was this enormous transition, and it ended with my father essentially abandoning me. He made the decision to move to Israel, and this was a part of his sort of spiritual messiahhood. And I just all I knew was Israel was forever away, and I wasn't going to see him. And in fact, that actually was what ended up happening. So I'm now 45, and I haven't seen him in person since I was 5, since that
Yeah.
day. And
Hmm.
I've had some intermittent contact with him, but he never really recovered
Yeah.
fully from his psychotic break. He kind of came back a little bit, but very defensive. He's still on his mission. Everybody is out to get him. So a kind of
Yeah.
paranoia. Um, so all of that led me more and more to this concept of like, okay, I feel like this troll under the bridge. I feel like a monster. And what happened? And I think what happened was I did what a lot of kids do when they come from abusive situations, which is I somehow felt I had done something wrong. My father abandoned me because I was bad. Um, uh, and then as I started to grow older and have issues with depression and things, I always felt guilty, like this was again was my fault and something's wrong with me.
Yeah.
And so that feeling of kind of being a monster or believing you are, that is the core piece of the monster's journey, that change in your identity where you believe something is broken about you. And
Right.
I started to test that out with clients. And for clients who had the early childhood trauma, it could be different. It could be sexual trauma or physical abuse. they also felt that way, that they had become
Hmm.
monsters. So it's not a judgment that somebody's a monster, as in they're a terrible human being. It's more like probably deep down they feel that there's something wrong with them. And I've never really read a book about spiritual and psychological development which talks about this. It
Hmm.
feels like it's a missing piece in all the many terrific books there are out there
Right.
about spiritual and psychological growth.
Right.
And so that's how it came together, and no other word ever really did it, uh,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So just also for our listeners of people questioning sort of traumatic experiences, and I know you mentioned the adverse childhood experiences, and just to give a list of some things that can count as trauma: recurrent and severe physical abuse, recurrent and severe emotional abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, growing up in a household with household substance abuse, a family member being imprisoned, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, the mother being treated violently. Um, yeah, so it's definitely, and so your book kind of talked about, you score sort of like a checklist, and sort of your kind of focus directed was sort of score a little bit of 4 or higher, right? Of sort of dealing with, but you could have sort of effects all throughout that scale, right?
Yeah. So the, this medical group, very large medical provider in California named Kaiser Permanente, did a huge study back in the late 90s asking basically 17,000 members about their early childhood experiences, and they put together the list that you just repeated of what they call these adverse childhood experiences. And what they did was essentially give you 1 point uh, for every category that you sort of are in. So if both parents were physically abusive, that would count as physical abuse and 1 point. If you were physically abused and emotionally neglected, 2 points. If you had a mental ill parent and then 2 other things, 3 points. And what they found essentially is that the more categories of these adverse childhood experiences, the bigger the impact was on your later mental health. So you might be much more likely to have depression. Rates of suicide attempts go up. Um, uh, Substance abuse goes up. Um, a certain high level of promiscuous sexual behavior goes up, and also do regular diseases like heart disease, diabetes, etc. They seem to move up. And there was something about 3 or 4 of these categories that seem to be a level of severity that uh, would make all these later life difficulties more likely. So there's not a one-to-one perfect correlation where everybody who experiences abuse ends up in this traumatized state. It's more complicated than that. Some people seem to be have an extra layer of resilience, but a large portion will end up. Um, Now, just to say something, you don't need to have 4 categories. If you had one that was really severe, severe physical abuse, that might move you into the monster's journey territory. But in the book, what I encourage people to do is to do this checklist to try to just get an objective viewpoint of what trauma did they go through, or if they're reading the book for a loved one, how
Hmm.
many categories has this loved one experienced. And
Right.
I like that objective take, because trauma can sometimes be used very loosely these days.
Hmm.
Something that was just a bit upsetting, people will say it was traumatizing.
Right.
But this checklist is really more like, hey, these are the heavy things. and we have to remember this is happening to children also.
Right.
Not that adults don't get trauma, adults do, but children are additionally vulnerable.
Yeah. So I know you're integrally informed, and I know reading this, I definitely, a couple things came up for me. I definitely got a sense of the shadow element and a little bit of what Wilbur talks about, the sort of the cleanup, sort of part of ourselves and stuff. And so another sort of, I know a common theme, and I don't know, just to kind of put you on the spot, that I've seen a lot in culture these days is sort of like this glorification of the anti-hero. So, the first guy that comes up for me is like sort of Tony Soprano, kind of thing. But I think also when I read the book, I really kind of got the sense like this is really diving into those characters where you might, see that monstrous side, but it also is addressing their own vulnerabilities and what they went through. And such a key piece that I think too, and I know you brought, there are a couple references to, I think of Daniel Segal's work in there about storytelling. How important is storytelling to the healing factor for you when you do your work?
I would say it's very important. In therapy, we would call it a narrative. So there's really good evidence that if a person had a very chaotic or traumatizing childhood, if through therapy they can develop a clear narrative, set of stories about themselves, why things happened, and putting the pieces together, that by itself is a powerful intervention. So you could imagine a client coming through, and they just have all these scattered memories and feelings and kind of wounds about whatever happened in childhood, and they're not putting them together in a narrative. And so there's a value to that, to do that. And what Joseph Campbell really offered was this way to understand the nature of stories that was really powerful. So his hero's journey, where someone starts out in their normal life and then they enter this period of initiation into magic and mystery. We could think of the Matrix here. So Neo, leaves he's in the Matrix, but he doesn't know it. And then he goes through this whole journey to discover what the Matrix is. And, in the end, he confronts, the force of the agents, and he overcomes them. So that's a nice hero's arc. And the way we apply that to ourselves is we start out maybe having a sort of call to a new life or a new struggle, and we have to take that hero's journey ourselves in our lives to confront what is unknown or scary, intimidating. And if we go with the process and make the effort, we will eventually overcome and become the hero in our own story. And there was nothing like that kind of story sense making for trauma survivors. And so sort of after I got that image of the troll and stuff, it was probably a couple of years, but I started to think about what are really the steps. And I went back and read Campbell, thought very hard about the therapeutic work I was doing myself and with other clients. And so it came up with this sort of a version of the hero's journey, which tells this monster story. And to a certain extent, it is a story, it's a kind of anti-hero story. Trauma survivors, have a lot of these powerful reactions. They feel like they have flaws. They have sometimes really just have tragedies in their life. And so how do they step forward, and what stories tell their stories? And one of the things I recognize that in modern literature is where we really start to see the empathy for the anti-hero or the empathy for the monster. So in the book, I take 4 novels basically, and I then apply the stages. Here's how it fits. And so one that I did was The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a story about this deeply disfigured um, uh, kind of anti-hero character, in that he sort of lives in the shadows in this church and rings the bell, but he's sort of scorned by his external environment, and yet he goes through this process of transformation uh, from sort of in the shadows to out into the light, and um, he people see his beauty and his worth. By the end of the story, he becomes sort of a heroic figure, but the place that he's starting from is a place of trauma. He was orphaned, he was scorned by the people of the town because he was so disfigured. And in modern literature, we try to put ourselves in the monster's quote unquote view of things, instead of just seeing monsters in the old way, which is monsters are something to be slain or overcome. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and that works in the hero's journey, but in the monster's journey, there's the monster has either is human underneath, or it has very human-like qualities. And so that's the discovery that happens in the journey. I am
Right.
okay. I am okay the way I am, and I may have been changed by the trauma, but that does not make me broken.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it may have, in fact, given me some unintended or unexpected gifts.
Right.
Um,
And so with your therapy work, in the book, you sort of talk about the place where I want to call it reconciliation. I'm not sure what the right word is, but sort of you're trying to when they meet the healer, and you're trying to, I'm not sure, connect to this or reveal to the patient, to the client, their sort of true self, right? So in your own practice, how difficult is that to sort of help the client start that process of discovering what I think you start off of the book talking about the child who's kind of lost that innocent state.
mhm.
Um, how difficult of a process is that? And how do you see the narrative process, the storytelling process, helping a client get back in touch with that original true self state?
Yes. So it is a difficult process to work with trauma. I think probably most trauma survivors would say it's not been an easy road.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's not an easy road, and clients come in all phases. So the sort of most basic one would be a client who comes in, really does not understand at all that they've been traumatized. They will tend to dismiss what happened. So I have a client who I started with who was routinely physically hit by her father and for years, and it scared her even though she tried to fight back. um, and she didn't connect this as being important at all for her. In other words, it was just something that happened. But as the therapy went on, I try to encourage the dialogue of, there's something really that has happened to you here, and it's playing out in all these symptoms. And for her, it was that she was often afraid to leave the house, afraid to be around adult men. So if she was in a line at a pharmacy or something and there were adult men around, she would be additionally very scared. And that's a pretty clear connection to having been abused by your father, but she wasn't sort of wiring those two things together in her mind. So in that case, when someone's starting really from the beginning, you got to do everything step by step, which is to see that something went wrong, to sort of name and try to understand the trauma, to start to ask the question, you know, has this had an effect on me? So everything is really basic by the by the numbers. Then if people recognize it, then we start to ask the question, well, okay, it has this effect on you. You get very scared when you're around adult men. You understand why, but what are the things that you can actually do to help the situation? And so in the book, you know, the way I speak about this is I really think that there are so many good therapeutic tools out there, some directly for trauma, some are a little more general therapy things. And I really encourage my traumatized clients to try everything that seems interesting, affordable, available in their area. And every piece of therapy you do brings a little back that you can start to work with. So it's almost like gathering rocks to build something. You got to kind of wander around and pick up certain pieces. And that process can really stretch out for a very long time. People will make progress, but when you have trauma, there's always these setbacks where you're doing well, you're doing better, you can catch some of your traumatic triggers and what's bothering you. And then, I don't know, you get into an argument in your relationship, and all of a sudden, all that old feeling comes back, and you feel like you haven't done a day of therapy in your life, and you're kind of on the floor.
Right.
And so then you pick yourself up and dust yourself off and try to keep going forward. But there's lots of these ups and downs in trauma recovery, and it takes a while. At the end of it, if you've done a lot of work, the best case scenario is the trauma is a little bit like the moon in daytime. If you've ever seen like the moon, looked out and see the moon in daytime, it's very faint. You don't
Hmm.
really notice it unless you're focusing. And
Yeah.
so it's not there, it's there, but it's not like the moon, the full moon at nighttime, which is where you start off, where all these traumatized feelings are coming at you pretty
Yeah.
frequently.
Yeah. That's a great
Um,
example. Definitely.
so yeah.
Another great piece I found in the book too is a lot of times, especially I know in the integral community, we talk about spiritual growth, and then knowing sometimes or thinking that maybe meditation is the cure all, and sometimes meditation
Mhm.
can even make things worse, especially if you have some traumatic experiences. And I think your layout of sort of, hey, watch out for these dangers here is the best that I've seen, sort of addressing that particular issue. So I just definitely wanted to publicly applaud you on that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, I've been a very long-term meditator, 25 years. Obviously not not like it, completely disciplined during all those 25 years, but a lot of periods of serious practice. And when I got into meditation, I noticed that sometimes it could be so difficult just to sit there, not even for long periods of time necessarily, but all these big, strong feelings. I was super judgmental of my practice, so frustrated with myself. And it took me, again, a long time to realize that there were times when I was sitting kind of in these sort of trauma activated states, and I didn't really know. And meditation is not the easiest thing in the world, but I just had this, it's not supposed to be this hard, to sit and not be in pain. So what I think is meditation can be a huge help and can break down all the doors that people talk about. And teach you how to be in expanded states of consciousness and to see through aspects of, your everyday ego and all of that. However, trauma survivors, you just have to be extra sensitive to when you're sitting and how long you're sitting. If you're really traumatized about something that happened or triggered, you want to be careful. Maybe you do a different practice, or maybe you do something like a walking meditation, which is just a little less inward and gives you sort of something to quote unquote do.
Mm-hmm.